Have you ever felt completely alone? On July 20th, 1969, a man orbited the moon. No crew, no radio contact with Earth for nearly an hour at a stretch. He became one of the most physically isolated humans in history. History called Michael Collins the loneliest man who ever lived. The strange thing is, the astronaut himself didn't quite agree. To understand why he'd say that, what he actually felt up there, and what he was actually risking, you have to understand exactly what his job was, and exactly how little margin he had if anything went wrong. Everyone remembers Apollo 11 as a two-man story. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, the first footprints. What gets left out, almost every time, is that Apollo 11 was a three-man mission, and the third man never set foot on the moon at all. Michael Collins was the command module pilot. While Armstrong and Aldrin flew the lunar module Eagle down to the surface, Collins stayed behind in the command module Columbia, orbiting the moon roughly 60 miles overhead, alone, for the better part of a full day. This wasn't a lesser job. It was, arguably, the job with the least room for error on the entire mission. Columbia was the only way home. If anything happened to it, if Collins lost the ability to fly it, navigate it, or keep it functioning, there was no rescue mission, no backup crew, no other spacecraft within 250,000 miles. Collins wasn't new to this kind of pressure. Before Apollo 11, he'd flown Gemini 10 in 1966, performing 2 spacewalks and participating in piloting a rendezvous and docking with a separate target vehicle in orbit. At the time, one of the most technically demanding maneuvers ever attempted in spaceflight. NASA didn't hand the Apollo 11 command module to somebody unproven. They handed it to one of the people they trusted most to fly precisely, under pressure, with no one to help if something went wrong. That trust mattered, because Collins' actual task on July 20th was almost unbelievably unforgiving. Once Eagle undocked and began its descent, Collins had to keep Columbia in a stable lunar orbit, run continuous systems checks, and, this is the part that tends to get lost in the popular telling, prepare for the possibility that Armstrong and Aldrin might never come back up to meet him. Here's the part of this story that's genuinely, scientifically extraordinary, and it has nothing to do with feelings. It's orbital mechanics. The moon has no atmosphere and no communications relay network. Radio waves, like light, travel in straight lines and bend only through diffraction, a process radio waves undergo far less readily than light does. Since the moon lacks a thick atmosphere or reflective layer to curve signals around its curvature, transmissions can't reach the far side. Every time Columbia's orbit carried it around to the far side of the moon, the side that never faces Earth, the moon's own mass sat directly between the spacecraft and every receiver on the planet. Not a weak signal. No signal at all. For roughly 48 minutes of every 2-hour orbit, Collins lost all communication with Houston completely. And it wasn't just Houston he lost. During that same blackout window, he also had no contact with Armstrong and Aldrin, down on the surface. If something had gone wrong on the moon during one of those windows, an emergency, a malfunction, anything, Collins wouldn't know. Mission Control wouldn't know. The only people who would know anything were 2 men standing on the lunar surface with no way to tell anyone. For roughly 21.5 hours, while Armstrong and Aldrin were on the lunar surface, Collins remained alone aboard Columbia. Multiple times per orbit, for the better part of a day, he was, by simple, measurable distance, the most physically isolated human being who had ever existed. 3 billion people on Earth, 2 men on the lunar surface, and 1 man, alone, on the far side of the moon, farther from every single one of them than any person in history up to that point. He wrote about that specific feeling later, recreating his thoughts for his 1974 memoir, Carrying the Fire. I am alone now, truly alone, and absolutely isolated from any known life. I am it. If account were taken, the score would be 3 billion plus 2 over on the other side of the moon, and 1 plus God only knows what on this side. That line further fueled his growing media reputation as the loneliest man in history. It's also, on its own, incomplete, and we'll come back to why that matters. Before we get to how Collins actually felt up there, it's worth sitting with what he was actually preparing for, because this is the part of the story that turns quiet isolation into genuine, calculated risk. If Eagle's ascent engine had failed to ignite on the lunar surface, a single engine, with no backup, that either fired or didn't, Armstrong and Aldrin would have been stranded on the moon permanently, with no possible rescue. And if Eagle had lifted off successfully, but failed to properly rendezvous and dock with Columbia, Collins would have faced a decision no astronaut, before or since, has ever had to actually make. He'd prepared for it anyway. Collins personally drew up a 117-page list of contingency procedures, covering exactly this scenario. Different rendezvous approaches, different orbital adjustments Columbia could attempt to try to reach a tumbling or off-course Eagle, in case the nominal plan didn't work. By his own account, he ran through that list mentally, again and again, during the hours Armstrong and Aldrin were on the surface, and he had already made peace, in his own mind, with what he'd do if none of it worked. In his own recollection of his thinking at the time, if they fail to rise from the surface or crash back into it, I am not going to commit suicide. I am coming home forthwith, but I will be a marked man for life. Hear that again. Collins had already decided, before the mission even reached the moon, that if his crewmates died on the lunar surface, his job was to fly home alone and live with it. Not because anyone ordered him to, because there was no version of the mission plan where staying behind or trying to follow them brought anyone back alive. He wasn't the only one preparing for that outcome. Back on Earth, presidential speechwriter William Safire had quietly drafted a statement for President Nixon, to be delivered only if Armstrong and Aldrin became permanently stranded. A speech that began, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace." It was never needed. It existed anyway, sitting ready in the West Wing, because NASA and the White House both understood exactly how real that possibility was. It's worth being specific about why that ascent engine was such a genuine unknown, rather than just a dramatic detail. Eagle's ascent stage had never been fired from the lunar surface before, not once, by anyone. Every system on it had been tested on Earth, in vacuum chambers, in simulations for hundreds of test firings. None of that fully replicates firing a rocket engine in 1/6 gravity, off a surface covered in fine, abrasive dust, using a spacecraft that had spent the previous several hours resting on its own descent stage in an environment no engine of its kind had ever operated in. If contamination, a stuck valve, or a structural issue from the landing had compromised that ascent engine in any way, there was no repair option, no backup engine, no towing service. The laws of orbital mechanics don't offer a second attempt. Even a successful launch didn't guarantee success. Eagle then had to execute a precise rendezvous with Columbia, matching orbital velocity and position with a target spacecraft it hadn't been in contact with for hours, using onboard guidance computers with a small fraction of the processing power of a modern calculator. Collins's contingency list existed because close enough doesn't work in orbital rendezvous. Either the trajectories intersect with the correct relative velocity, or they don't intersect at all. And there is no in-between, where you simply try again, 5 minutes later, with the same amount of fuel you started with. And this is really where the popular loneliest man in history framing needs a correction. One that Collins made himself more than once later in life. The full quote from Carrying the Fire, the one everyone truncates to truly alone, absolutely isolated, actually continues. Here's the rest of it, in his own words. I feel this powerfully, not as fear or loneliness, but as awareness, anticipation, satisfaction, confidence, almost exaltation. I like the feeling. Outside my window I can see stars, and that is all. Where I know the moon to be, there is simply a black void. The moon's presence is defined solely by the absence of stars. That's not a man describing pure dread. That's a trained test pilot describing something closer to reverence. Decades later, Collins pushed back on the loneliest man label directly, writing with characteristic dry humor that while he wouldn't claim to have had the best seat of the three available on Apollo 11, he was, in his own words, perfectly satisfied with the one I have. There's also a factual wrinkle worth including here, because accuracy matters more than mythology. Collins wasn't even the first person to orbit the moon completely alone. Astronaut John Young did it 2 months earlier, on Apollo 10, the full dress rehearsal for the landing, minus the actual landing. And Collins doesn't hold the technical record for extreme isolation either. That distinction belongs to Al Worden, command module pilot of Apollo 15 2 years later, whose different lunar orbit put him even farther from his own crewmates than Collins ever was, a distance formally recognized by Guinness World Records as the most isolated a human being has ever been from all other people. None of that diminishes what Collins did. If anything, it reframes it. He wasn't uniquely cursed with isolation. He was one of a handful of test pilots who volunteered, specifically, for a role built entirely around trusting his own skill and his own calm, under a kind of pressure most people will never come close to experiencing. Hours of total radio silence. The knowledge that 2 colleagues' lives depended on a rendezvous that had never been attempted from the lunar surface before, and a contingency plan he'd written himself for the outcome nobody wanted to say out loud. So which version is the real story? The loneliest man in history, or a pilot who found something close to peace in the one moment almost no other human being will ever get to experience? Both, probably. Collins wasn't lying about the isolation. 48 minutes of total radio blackout on the far side of a world with no atmosphere is objectively as alone as a human being can physically be, a fact backed by simple geometry, not exaggeration. But he also wasn't lying about how it felt, and that distinction is worth remembering. It says something about who gets sent to do jobs like this in the first place. NASA didn't just need someone who could survive being alone. They needed someone who wouldn't come apart under the weight of it, who could keep running system checks and mental contingency plans through hour after hour of complete silence. On the off chance, the 2 most famous astronauts in human history needed a rescue he'd personally designed. Michael Collins passed away in 2021, at 90 years old. He spent the rest of his life being introduced as the loneliest man who ever lived, and spent just as much of it, patiently, correcting the record. Maybe that's the more interesting story anyway. Not a man broken by solitude, but a professional, trained for exactly this scenario, who spent those 48-minute blackouts doing precisely what he was supposed to do, running numbers, checking systems, and waiting for a signal that, this time, came back through. If you want more of these, subscribe. And if you'd been in that seat, running the same contingencies in your head, with 48 minutes of total silence, and no way to know if your crewmates were even still alive, I'd genuinely like to hear what you think it would feel like to be truly, completely alone. Let me know in the comments below.